Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're analyzing how a seemingly impossible David versus Goliath scenario actually played out on the ground in 1831. We're looking at the Polish-Russian War. This was a conflict where a massive Russian imperial army, we're talking hundreds of thousands of men, marched against a Polish forest that was just a mere fraction of its size. Now, on paper, this should have been a rapid, overwhelming victory for the Russian Empire, but instead, the conflict dragged on and completely defied all the conventional military expectations of the era.
So here is the central paradox we need to unpack. How exactly did a vastly outnumbered army manage to hold off the incredibly mighty Russian Empire for 8 grueling months? In 19th century warfare, overwhelming numerical superiority usually meant a swift, decisive end to the fighting, right? But to understand how this historical anomaly happened, we really have to look past the sheer statistics. We're going to meticulously dissect the structural, logistical, and leadership factors that actually leveled the playing field and transformed what was supposed to be a total walkover into a protracted, exhausting campaign.
Here's how we're going to break down the campaign in this explainer. First, the origins of the unequal fight, followed by a comparative army analysis. Then we'll get into the absolute nightmare of war logistics, the clash of commanders' minds, and finally, wrap up with our strategic campaign conclusions.
All right, let's start with Section 1, the origins of the unequal fight, setting the stage in 1830. To truly grasp the mechanics of this conflict, we need to impartially set the historical context and focus purely on the cold, hard military realities of the time. And to do this right, we're relying on highly rigorous expert military analysis. The foundational text for our breakdown is the meticulous work of A.K. Puziarevsky, who was an instructor at the Imperial Military Academy. He pulled from an incredible wealth of primary sources, and this is absolutely crucial, because documents like Field Marshal Daibich's secret correspondence reveal the unvarnished truth of the Russian High Command, totally bypassing the official state propaganda of the era. When you combine that with the Gacina memoirs written by Polish General Prądzyński and the exhaustive campaign diaries of Russian Count Toll, well, you realize this isn't guesswork. It's a deep, objective evaluation of military history.
Moving right along to Section 2, Comparative Army Analysis and Asymmetric Warfare. Let's directly contrast these two forces, because their fundamental composition practically dictated their battlefield performance. The Russian army, as we know, had massive, overwhelming numbers, but it suffered from systemic peacetime issues driven by what was basically a cult of the parade. Their training heavily prioritized rigid, parade ground mechanics over practical combat skills. Soldiers were severely punished for having dirty weapons, which perversely led to so much overpolishing that it frequently destroyed the internal firing mechanisms of their rifles. I mean, they literally ruined their own guns to pass inspection. On the other side, the much smaller Polish army was highly trained under strict Napoleonic tactical standards. Many of these guys were seasoned combat veterans who deeply understood practical warfare. Driven by an existential zeal, they excelled at fluid, cohesive tactical movements under fire, easily transitioning from marching columns to firing lines when engaging the enemy.
Which brings us to a really fascinating psychological assessment from General Brandt. As a Prussian officer observing the Russian ranks, he provides a highly credible, neutral, and thoroughly professional military assessment of the era. He noted that the Russian soldiers were brave, uncomplaining, and fiercely loyal. He actually called them the first soldiers of the world. But he acutely observed that they were poorly developed, calling them a rich material for a thinking psychologist. This perfectly captures the tragic reality of the Russian rank and file. Their incredible natural bravery was effectively neutralized by an overly rigid mechanical system of doctrine that severely punished any independent initiative.
Now, this internal friction created massive strategic vulnerabilities, and it's brilliantly illustrated by the Russian Army's Lithuanian Corps. The composition of this unit was incredibly complex. The rank and file were primarily local Belarusian soldiers. They were commanded at the very top by Russian senior officers, but heavily staffed in the middle by Polish junior officers. And you guessed it, many of those junior officers secretly belonged to Polish patriotic societies. So this wasn't just a matter of poor morale. It meant that critical orders were intentionally delayed, entirely misinterpreted, or sometimes just flat out ignored. This severe internal political friction translated directly into a paralyzing lack of cohesion and fatal hesitations right there on the battlefield. Now for Section 3, the nightmare of war logistics, or, as I like to call them, the hidden killers. The data from Puziarevsky's work introduces us to the brutal reality of operational friction. Quite simply, logistics entirely dictated this war.
A massive army requires a massive, unbroken umbilical cord of supplies. But because of catastrophic failures in administration, the Russian army's vast size actually became a crippling vulnerability. Without a steady stream of food, which was terribly managed, and with deeply inadequate medical provisions, their sheer numbers simply meant they had more mouths to starve. This effectively transformed their greatest strategic asset into a fatal liability that zeroed out their early gains.
To really understand the scale of this logistical nightmare, we have to look at the severe geographic and environmental challenges. First off, the massive Russian army was spread across a vast territory with incredibly poor road networks. Second, the sudden outbreak of war completely disrupted their planned peacetime supply routes, forcing heavy supply wagons to navigate through deep mud and harsh weather. And third, the resulting immense food shortages and medical failures fundamentally broke their operational tempo. You can draft all the men in the empire, but if the logistical spine of your military snaps, your strategic operations are going to stall entirely.
Let's move into Section 4, Clash of Commanders' Minds, Strategy versus Paranoia. We must look closely at the highest levels of command to see why this war dragged on the way it did. On the Polish side, we have General Prądzyński. According to both Russian and Polish primary sources, he was undeniably the most capable Polish strategist of the conflict. He was the architect of some truly bold defensive plans, specifically envisioning rapid strikes against isolated Russian corps to destroy them piece by piece before they could successfully mass their numbers. Yet, tragically for the Polish forces, his brilliance was frequently sidelined due to deep political jealousy and sharp differences in military philosophy with the cautious Supreme Commander.
And over on the Russian side, taking over in the second half of the campaign, we have Field Marshal Paskievich. The historical archives paint a stark and highly specific contrast in his character. He was personally brave, for sure, but as a top commander, he was paralyzingly overly cautious and deeply suspicious of his own staff. A critical piece of context here is his background. His primary command experience was in the Asiatic Wars, fighting irregular forces. This specific mindset made him entirely ill-suited for a conventional European theater against a conventionally trained Napoleonic army.
Interestingly, Paskievich obsessively repeated this grand Napoleonic mantra, which translates to, "One must strike a great blow. On a day of battle, one must gather all one can." He spoke constantly of sweeping, decisive actions. Yet, when we take a closer look at his command, it reveals a massive contrast between his bold, imported French words and his actual behavior on the battlefield.
You see, Paskevich's reality on the battlefield was dictated by his Asiatic war experience. He was highly paranoid of even minor flank threats, frequently halting the entire army's momentum to deal with phantom issues. Out of an intense fear of Polish partisans, he kept his massive supply wagons far, far too close to the marching troops, which completely clogged the few viable roads they had. This constant pausing to protect wagons essentially surrendered the operational initiative entirely to the Poles. Naturally, this led to bitter, constant clashes with his own energetic staff officers like Count Toll, who strongly favored aggressive, rapid movement. It created a deeply divided and dysfunctional Russian high command.
Finally, Section 5, Strategic Campaign Conclusions, Analyzing the 8 Months.
So, tying all of these threads together, why did this grossly unequal war actually last for 8 months? Well, the expert analysis points to 4 robust factors. First, the initial geographic dispersal of the massive Russian forces. Second, the Polish advantage of territorial concentration. By fighting on interior lines, they enjoyed a massive tactical advantage and rapid internal supply mobilization over the stretched-out Russians. Third, the high tactical readiness and practical combat experience of the Polish troops. And fourth, the severe, crippling Russian logistical failures combined with the extreme doctrinal caution of their leadership.
Beyond the grand strategy, we absolutely must acknowledge the critical reality of execution failures. Despite having solid tactical manuals, lower-level officers on both sides frequently failed to execute basic battlefield requirements. For example, they routinely failed to deploy proper cavalry screens or run adequate reconnaissance. In 19th century warfare, advancing without a cavalry screen meant massive formations were essentially marching blindfolded. This heavily increased the risk of blundering into devastating ambushes and rendered all that high-level strategy completely moot.
Looking back at the undeniable reality of 1831, we're left with a vital question to ponder. Is the outcome of historical wars decided more by the sheer tactical genius of commanders on the battlefield or by the invisible, fragile lines of logistics and supply? The Polish-Russian War stands as a timeless masterclass in how logistical rot, internal friction, and rigid military doctrine can effectively neutralize the largest armies on Earth. It's a profound structural reality of war that forces us to completely rethink how military history is truly made.